G'day. Australia is home to many unique and beautiful animals, but it could also be home to creatures a little more frightening. I don't just mean our snakes, spiders or man-eating crocs though. I'm talking about something a lot more terrifying. Something that you hopefully never ever have to see, or have it see you. Here are 5 frightening stories of some of the darker encounters.
Okay, so this is my story. I was 15, I was at my boyfriend's house, and it was about 10:30 p.m. We were sitting on his trampoline in his backyard, which faces a small park behind his house. His yard is on a ground level about a metre, 3-ish feet above the ground level the park is on, and his fence is on that lower level. So, by sitting on the trampoline, we could see out into the darkness of the park, which was just slightly illuminated by his yard lights. We're talking when suddenly I feel an eerie chill, like we're being watched, like something wants us to know we're being watched. I remember glancing all over the place and jumping at the smallest sounds of the night. My boyfriend laughing at me, all before he suddenly stilled and rose up onto his knees to look at something in the park. "There's a man watching us from that tree." Those words still chill me to the core. I froze and asked him to tell me what he was doing. He told me that the man was very tall, almost halfway up the tree, which was a large eucalyptus tree, and that only his head and shoulder were really visible, and that his eyes were glowing or reflecting the light from his yard lights. I wondered if he was lying and making fun of me again for being paranoid earlier, so I sat up and leaned over him to see the thing next to the tree. There it was. It was tall, darker than the shadows of the trees, and it wasn't lit up like the trees were from the lights. Its eyes were shining brightly, and it was exceptionally tall. It couldn't have been a man, if not for the shoulder and arm draped over the tree, and so it was not an animal either. I fell back onto the trampoline and my boyfriend told me to be quiet and to start moving back towards the house. It was moving towards us. I shook my head. I did not want to move. I couldn't bring myself to move. I was frozen in fear. I don't know, but I remember he had to force me up, swearing loudly and telling me it was nearly at the fence. I got up and caught a glance of a figure nearly across the short distance from the trees to his yard and booked it to the stairs up to his front door. I glanced back to look again. My boyfriend yelled not to, that it was climbing over the fence. I somehow moved even faster and made it to the door without tripping up the stairs and breaking a leg. He told me again it had been trying to climb over the fence when I slowed down to take a look. His father swears it was a demon trying to test their faith or something, but I don't think it was. I had another encounter, maybe a month later, and my boyfriend told me a figure was watching me from exposed ceiling beams of my old barn-like house during a FaceTime call late at night. Maybe a shadow man, maybe an Australian version of a skinwalker. I'm 19 now and I still can't stop thinking about what happened. If anyone knows what this sort of aggressive stalker behaviour means and what this creature was, please let me know. It was definitely not just some creepy man. This shadowy thing was at least 3 meters tall and had bright glowing white eyes. So this happened around 5 or 6 years ago. I live in Perth, Western Australia. Me and my best friend lived in the same suburb at the time. We were underage, so when it came to weekends, we usually just went exploring around parks and in the quarry in our neighbourhood. It was late at night, and we were still just wandering the streets near our houses, doing whatever we were doing. We dared ourselves to go into the quarry at night, which is pitch black and surrounded by bushland. It's a decent sized area, bigger than a football field. We chickened out at the entrance and I decided to sit on a rock just outside the quarry while we were chatting. So just to give you an idea of my position, my back was facing the bushes and the quarry and I were facing towards my friend. Her face suddenly went blank mid-conversation and she just froze up for a few seconds before sprinting off and yelling at me to run after her. I had no idea what was going on, but I ended up booking it. Honestly, I thought it was some sort of human threat, like a dodgy person. We ran like 2 streets down before she managed to stop, and I could get her to talk for a few minutes. She was absolutely terrified. She told me that when she was talking to me, a face appeared just to the left of my shoulder, probably around 1 meter back and coming from the bushes. She couldn't really see if there was a body, but she just described the face. She said it was evil and had this menacing presence that she couldn't describe. I can't get her to accurately describe what she saw, but she said that it was like the features weren't defined. She said that the eyes were blackened out, and she remembers it having a terrifying grin on its face. I'd like to mention a few key points before I share some of the things that happened to me. I'm not looking for fame nor attention, and everything contained within is 100% factual. I'm an Australian. These occurrences happened on the central coast of New South Wales. Now, I'm an avid outdoorsman with a keen interest and in-depth knowledge of Australian native fauna. Each of these occurrences have a witness, apart from myself. I don't claim these events are paranormal, yet I am to this day still without a reasonable explanation. I live on the New South Wales Central Coast in an area that has houses in close proximity to Brisbane Water National Park, literally within metres from some back fences. Myself and my partner hold a keen interest which sees us venture into bushland regularly. For argument's sake, let's say we are avid birdwatchers. A few weeks ago, the local fire service commenced backburning in parts of the Brisbane Water National Park over 2 or so days, which was obviously for hazard reduction. Most of the fire was directed at burning off leaf litter and dry debris, which covers the ground in an effort to reduce the chances of spot fires, which have in the past become large fires and threaten houses and cause neighbouring suburbs to be evacuated. Because of the way the backburning was controlled, it completely burned off the debris, and basically 90% of flora that was over 2 or so feet seemed to have survived, except some charring, of course. Even some grass plants survived, while others were completely burned, including their underground roots, which left large round circles in the substrate. This meant the canopy was fully intact. That is an important point in my story. The fire was controlled so well, the left-hand side was completely obliterated by fire, while the right side was untouched. Now the path is about 3 to 4 feet wide at its widest points. Anyway, after about 48 hours after the fire service had finished backburning, my partner and myself ventured into a large patch of Brisbane Water National Park, along a track we have walked no less than 200 times in the last 10 years. The first thing we noticed, of course, was the lack of small shrubs and ground cover, which had been replaced by a 3 to 4 centimetre layer of ash. It was also hard not to notice the smell and non-visible smokiness, which irritated our throats and noses. But by far, the most profound thing we noticed was just how quiet it was. Usually, we hear birds chirping and snakes slithering into the underbrush, lizards scampering out of the way, and ducks splashing around in the creek that runs along the whole length of the walking track to the right. Across the creek, there are literally kilometres of bush in all directions. So it was a little odd that it was so desolate, even after backburning. We decided to press on, even though we were pretty sure that we weren't going to see any wildlife. We continued along the track for about another 20 minutes, all the while chatting about nothing in particular, when all of a sudden, we see 2 vertical lines which stand at about 6 feet tall and 4 centimetres or so in circumference come towards us like they've been shook, held back, and released towards us, almost like a slingshot. We immediately run over to the trees, about 4 meters or so off the track, because we thought it may have been caused by wildlife. My first instinct was to look up, as it may have been a large bird fleeing, but there were no birds at all in any of the trees, and we would have seen or heard the wing flapping and it breaking through the canopy. It wasn't any type of goanna, as we only have 2 types which occur naturally here, and both are arboreal and will take to the nearest tree when threatened. We checked every tree, every hollow log, and any type of ground cover which survived the fire, and found nothing. Definitely would have been spotted when we checked the trees and surrounding ground cover. It also wasn't any type of snake, as the only arboreal snake we have locally is the diamond python, which I could spot from a mile away. We continued walking for another 3 kilometers down the track, and the whole time felt like we were being watched, and I was quite uneasy. That feeling completely left as soon as we turned around and backtracked and headed towards home. My partner and myself went out on another adventure, but this time we were looking for nocturnal animals to photograph. We went to a waterfall which was only about 15 minutes from our house, but it's rather secluded and completely dead at night. Funnily enough, it becomes packed on the weekends during the day in the warmer months. The layout of the waterfall is basically a large parking lot at the top of the waterfall, which has a small park with barbecues, tables, and a small block of toilets. From the parking lot, you can also access the very top of the waterfall, which is basically a rock escarpment with water running through it. You can also access stairs that take you down to both the middle of the waterfall, which is just a huge rock platform, and the very bottom of the waterfall. It takes about 20 minutes to walk from top to bottom. Anyway, we parked the car and I grabbed my gear, which included my camera. We start making our way towards the top of the falls, which has a 2-foot barrier you have to step over to access the rock escarpment. Right as I went to put my leg over the fence, I heard the most disturbing noise I have ever heard. It sounded like a human moaning in pain. But to describe it the best I can, imagine 10 different people with 10 different voice qualities, all making the same moaning sound at the same time. I'm not one to frighten easily, but I have to admit, it sent chills up my spine. I told my partner to hurry up and get back to the car, and I locked the doors as soon as we got in and we left in a hurry. Now, this place is pitch dark. There are 0 lights, and there is no way in hell you'd be there without a torch. Not to mention you'd be able to tell anyone was even there by the cars parked in the parking lot, as this isn't a place you'd walk to. When I told a close friend of mine, who also frequents the waterfall to photograph wildlife, he told me he also had an experience the night before, which happened to be the night after I'd been there. He'd finished work late and thought he'd go for a quick walk around to see what he could find. This was in the Australian spring, when everything is out and about due to the warm and humid weather. He said he'd parked his car and got about halfway down the stairs to the bottom of the falls when he came across a snake. He was photographing it when he heard the door of the toilet block being slammed repeatedly. He started running up the stairs to get back to his car, and he said as he was running up, it sounded like something was going mental, slamming things within the toilet block. He got in his car and left. My friend and I, we decided to go check out the waterfall that night to see if we could find anything. We parked the car and went straight to the toilet block. We checked the block that he had heard the commotion in and found a reasonable amount of blood inside the basin and a small pool in the basin's soap dish. We contemplated calling the police, but weren't exactly sure what we would say. We left soon after, and neither of us visited that place for over a month afterwards. Since then, we've been back to this place multiple times without incident. On to the last night. We headed out along a road on the Central Coast, which by day is rather busy due to the high number of residences and farms that are along this road. By night, it's usually very quiet with a few cars using it sporadically, so I have my high beams on 95% of the time. We drove along this road for about 40 minutes in search of marsupials to photograph. This road intersects large masses of bush on both sides. I'd also like to add at this point that this road is not straight or level by any means. There are a mixture of turns as well as slight to aggressive inclines and declines along basically the entirety of this road. After driving for 40 minutes without any luck, we decided to head back along the same route we took. We were driving for about 10 to 15 minutes on our way back when we hit one of the very slight, gradual inclines along the road. When we were about halfway up the incline, I noticed something in the distance, maybe 200 to 250 metres or so, which I initially thought was a shadow being cast from residual lighting of my high beams, when all of a sudden, it moved from the middle of the road to the right side. And while the figure was still in motion, I asked the passenger and the person who'd been present for the 3 unexplained experiences, "Can you see that?" To which they replied, "Yes. What is it?" We got to the top of the incline and onto level ground once again and stopped in the location we saw it. Pulling out one of my torches, surveying where we'd seen it. To my surprise, where I had crossed to was a small property, which was essentially a house with a very small paddock with horses out the front. But what caught my attention was the horses were not startled in the slightest and could actually see one of them close to the fence eating. After about 2 minutes of surveying the area, I continued along the road and asked my partner exactly what they had seen. They relayed exactly what I had seen, which was a tall, maybe 6 foot, but with about a 2.5 foot wide profile, but rounded. It was very hard to gauge an exact height because since we were on an incline, for instance, say a person was to walk in that exact spot, we would only be able to see from the knees up due to the blind spot on the summit. My passenger added another piece of information, which was that it was rusty coloured. I didn't see any colour, but have to admit that I was paying as much attention to the road as I was to the figure, and as I was travelling at approximately 70 k's per hour, I really had to keep my attention on the road while trying to get to the summit as quick as possible to see what it was. I'd just like to add another detail, which I find is rather strange. While I couldn't see the figure's complete leg area, it didn't seem to be walking in a normal fashion. It was almost like it was gliding. I know that seems odd, but if I had to liken the body shape to a known animal, it would definitely, without a doubt, be an orangutan, but standing a fair bit taller and not as hunched in the lower back area. So there you have it. I no longer live in that area. I now live 40 minutes north of there, but I still visit often due to family. I'd like to point out that all of the above happened within about a 6-week period, which all seemed to start with hazard reduction backburning. Aussie summers are harsh. I've not had any weird happenings since then. I still spend a ridiculous amount of my time out in the bush. I will not give away my profession, but I will say I'm in a scientific field that works with wildlife, a scientific field which claims animals, such as the above, are not endemic to Australia. I'm an Indigenous Australian, a 36-year-old female, First Nations. Due to colonisation, I'm obviously not what one would consider a full blood, but nevertheless, I identify as Indigenous. I grew up hearing stories about yowies and hairy men. Yowies are small meerkat-type creatures, and hairy men are what would be considered a Sasquatch-type creature. In my youth, maybe around 16 years old, my cousins, who were also similar ages, and myself would go spend holidays with family in a town with a large population of Indigenous people. I'm not gonna lie, we were here for the boys. This one particular summer night, we had decided to walk into town. Where our family lived was maybe 2 to 3 kilometres out of town, but the road was a highway which was lit all the way and had a cemented path all the way from town which ran alongside a cleared field. The grass wasn't mowed, but it wasn't what you would say was overgrown, just at that in-between stage of being mowed a few weeks back. So we started our trek home at about midnight this night. There were 4 of us girls, 2 in front and 2 in back. We got about 100 metres out of town when myself and my cousin looked up and noticed what looked like a large man with a long black coat and hat, walking towards us. He was about 150 metres ahead. Now, the path, like I said, was a straight shot with streetlights the whole way along. We hadn't been drinking or smoking anything. We paused and were like, shit, who's that? And stood there, debating whether or not to continue. The whole time, I didn't take my eyes off this person. As my cousins glanced back and forth during the debate, we all stopped talking once we noticed that this man had all of a sudden turned into a type of haze or fog. Picture it like someone blurring out a person in a photograph, like it was out of focus, but everything around was clear as day. All of a sudden, this man was now a little creature. It was hard to estimate size, but I'm thinking similar to a meerkat or a large rabbit up on its hind legs. It was looking straight in our direction. Then after about 5 to 10 seconds, it hazed over again and completely disappeared. We all saw it, and we still talk about it to this day. I'm pretty confident that it was a yowie or a little hairy man. There's different theories in the Indigenous community about them. Some believe that they live under riverbeds. Some think they live inside cattle. There's also people who say they lure little kids away into the bush. The Indigenous people of Australia have up to 75 different dialects, depending on the region where they come from. So the name of this being could be called something entirely different in the other dialects, but my local tribe called it the Kurdaitcha man. Growing up in an outback town, you get a lot of freedom you take for granted, but that freedom could also get you into trouble, big trouble. This occurred when I was about 11 years old. My Aboriginal friend and I were walking around town, bored out of our brains during school holidays. The rest of our friends had gone away for the holidays. So we decided to go fishing in our secret spot down by the old Aboriginal encampment, where they moved after the occupation of their land in our area, which was about 15 kilometres out of town. We headed around to the butchery to pick up some meat for yabbies, to his house for rods and traps, and then my house for food, drinks and a shovel. We planned to dig for our worms out by the river. We got all the necessary supplies and headed out along the side of the highway. We were walking and talking and just stuffing around when we finally got there. We headed down the sand road and came across a fence that blocked off the sacred land. There was a statue of some sort on the boundary, and my mate stopped and said a few words. He always said that his dad told him to do it. Otherwise, the bad spirits could see us. I told him that it was silly and skipped it. We go down the back of the camp and walk on another kilometre or so and find our spot. And there was a nice breeze blowing through all the old ghost gums. We could see the fish jumping and knew we were in for a good day. We started to dig around for worms and come up with a few big good ones and get to fishing. The day gets on, and it turns out that we are terrible fishermen with rods, so we abandon them and get in the water to catch them with our hands. Turns out I'm also terrible at that, but my mate ends up catching a decent-sized yellow belly, so we keep it for eating and showing off, obviously. We hadn't kept an eye on the time, and before we knew it, the sun had set. My friend starts getting really nervous, saying that it's time to get out of here and that we really need to leave. I asked him why, and he says that it's really unsafe to be out there after dark. I laugh, and at that exact moment, there was a huge splash in the water behind us. We both shit a little, but with our child bravery, we check it out and couldn't say a thing. Just ripples on top of the water. We dismiss it as a big fish and start to pack up our stuff to leave. By the time we start our march back, it's pitch black and we can barely see our hands in front of us, and forgot to pack a torch, so we kind of fumble our way through the bush until our eyes adjusted. We were walking for about 20 minutes when we stop. We can hear heavy footsteps off to our left, about 15 metres away. We strain our hearing and the footsteps stop. We then realise that the bush is silent. No wind, nothing. Our eyes have adjusted to the dark, so we can kind of see where we're going, and we realise we've overshot the road by about half a kilometre, and whatever was making the footsteps was between us and the road. So we decide to push on and come out along the highway further up the road. That was a mistake. The footsteps keep persisting, sometimes closer and sometimes further away. I swear at times I could hear low mumbling. I kept saying to my friend, but he told me to shut up and don't look back. It can't see us, was what he kept saying. So I push on, my feeling getting more and more uneasy. The second we hear a loud crash come from our left on a small animal trail, we were on and my mate grabs me and pulls me off into the scrub, tells me to lay down. As we're laying there, we see a silhouette loom up to the path. It kind of has an outline of feathers on it and is extremely tall and humanoid, but sickly thin. It is going from tree to tree, not very far from us, and is looking all around, snapping its head and making a low mumbling sound as it moves. It was looking for us. It keeps moving around where we were and suddenly stops, looking back down the path, and we hear what could have been a kangaroo jump off into the bush. The being let out an unearthly scream that hurt our ears and shoots off down the path faster than anything I've ever seen. I looked to my mate and whispered to him if he had just seen what I had. But when I looked, he'd had his head in his hands the whole time. He answered, "We're not allowed to look." His cheeks were all tear-stained. He whispered, "I told you he would see you." We waited what felt like 2 hours and then bailed out of the bushes and ran the remaining distance to town, losing our fish along the way and some of our stuff. We finally made it, and every time I tried to bring it up with him, he told me to shut my mouth or it would come back. So I eventually stopped trying. I haven't been able to sleep right since.